In October 14, 1943, 15,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. The morning sky was thin and brittle, like glass. Sunlight flickered off the canopies of hundreds of silver bombers as they droned eastward, their engines beating an unrelenting rhythm that echoed across Europe. Far below, the clouds hung like ghosts over the city of Schweinfurt, home to the factories that kept the German war machine alive. From the cockpit of his Focke-Wulf 190, Oberleutnant Heinrich Koch watched them come. The vast armada of American B-17 flying fortresses filled the horizon, a metallic tide that stretched from one edge of the sky to the other. For a moment, even he felt a grim respect. To fly this deep into the Reich without fighter escort was an act of sheer defiance, or madness. He flipped open his logbook, its corners darkened with oil and sweat, and scribbled a short note beside the entry marked for this day. 17th Bomber destroyed. Formation scattered. Black smoke and falling angels. He closed the book with quiet satisfaction. Another victory. Another tiny contribution to what he believed was the defense of his homeland. But the truth that neither Koch nor his comrades could yet see was that this day, later named Black Thursday, would mark not the peak of German dominance, but the beginning of its collapse. That morning, 291 B-17s had crossed the North Sea under clear skies, bound for the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, the beating heart of German industry. They flew in tight combat boxes, each fortress bristling with 50-caliber machine guns, their crews trusting in geometry and courage to keep them alive. The mathematics of survival seemed clear. Each bomber could protect its neighbor, each gun covering another's blind spot. But mathematics is cruel in war. As the formation approached German airspace, the radio crackled with clipped voices. Altitude calls, formation checks, murmured prayers. Then, from the sun above and behind, came the hunters, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, dozens of them, diving like falcons from the light. Their engines screamed as they cut through the bomber's stream, cannon shells tearing through aluminum and flesh alike. Gunners fired back in all directions, tracer lines arcing across the sky, but most found only empty air. For the German pilots, the attacks had become almost mechanical. Dive from 12 o'clock high, fire 2 seconds, break off, climb again, repeat. Months of practice had turned it into science. They had learned the bomber's weaknesses, the vulnerable nose, the blind spots around the tail, the finite belts of ammunition that ran dry too quickly. Major Heinrich Heinz Koche, commander of 5JG-11, had perfected the most lethal technique of all, the head-on attack. He would approach at over 400 miles per hour, fire a brief burst at the cockpit and engines, and peel away before the top turret could even swing into position. On this day, his method worked to terrible effect. The air filled with fire and falling wreckage. Entire formations disintegrated under the relentless assault. One bomber exploded mid-air, scattering burning debris across the cloud tops. Another spiraled downward, trailing smoke that reached almost to the ground. By the time the last fortress turned for home, 60 lay shattered across German fields. 17 more limped back to England, so damaged they would never fly again. Over 600 men were dead or captured. The Luftwaffe pilots returned to their airfields triumphant, greeted by mechanics with cigarettes and steaming mugs of coffee. Laughter filled the dispersal huts. They called it a turkey shoot. But among the survivors of the raid, in the cold air over the channel, the mood was different. Sergeant Harold Mac McIntyre, a waist gunner aboard a crippled B-17 named Lucky Lady, watched as another bomber, its right wing aflame, plunged into the sea. "They came out of the sun," he wrote later. "We never stood a chance. We were just meat up there." In the debriefing rooms of the 8th Air Force that evening, silence replaced optimism. The mission's losses were catastrophic. The men called it Black Thursday, the darkest day in their history. Yet, even as generals weighed the cost and debated the future of daylight bombing, something deeper was beginning to stir in the minds of American engineers and strategists. Because beneath the smoke of Schweinfurt lay a problem that could not be solved by courage alone: range. The bombers had flown unescorted for most of their journey. Their fighter protection, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, could reach only to the German border. Beyond that point, they were alone. The Luftwaffe called it the golden moment, the point where the little friends turned back, leaving the bombers naked before the hunters. Oberst Hans Philipp, one of Germany's top aces with over 200 victories, described it simply: "We waited until the escorts left. Then we pounced." It was a system that worked, for now. But wars turn on inventions, not on habits. Across the channel, in dim hangars lit by flickering lamps, engineers at North American Aviation were working on something that promised to change everything. Not a bomber, not a heavy beast of defense, but a predator. Sleek, long-legged, and fast. Its name was simple, almost modest: the P-51 Mustang. It had begun as a British request. The Royal Air Force had wanted more P-40s, but the Americans had offered to design an entirely new aircraft instead, something that could be built in just 120 days. The first prototype flew in October 1940. Its lines were elegant, its wing smooth as a blade, but it carried the wrong heart, an Allison engine that gasped for breath above 15,000 feet. For now, it was a low-altitude scout, a reconnaissance plane. But in April 1942, in a Rolls-Royce test hangar in England, a British pilot named Ronald Harker climbed into the cockpit of one of these early Mustangs and returned wide-eyed. "This machine," he wrote, "is the airframe of the future. All it lacks is the proper engine." That engine would be the Merlin, the same one that gave the Spitfire its soul. And when the two met, something extraordinary happened. The hybrid that emerged in 1943 was faster, higher, and more enduring than anything the world had yet seen. The Mustang's laminar flow wing cut through the air with 30% less drag. It could fly farther, climb higher, and fight longer than any other single-engine aircraft on Earth. While German pilots celebrated their easy victories, the answer to their dominance was already taking shape in American factories. Rows of unpainted Mustangs gleaming under the fluorescent lights, their propellers still, their promise silent. Back in Germany, Luftwaffe commanders met in smoke-filled rooms, plotting the next raid's defense. Maps were spread across oak tables, markers tracing the bombers' likely routes. Confidence ran high. Major Günther Rau, one of Germany's finest aces, told his men, "They will come again, and we will destroy them again. The Reich's airspace is inviolable." Yet even he, gazing into the night sky above his airfield, could not have imagined what would soon appear there: an aircraft that would erase the very idea of sanctuary. For now, the laughter continued in the German mess halls. The pilots toasted another victory, unaware that they were drinking to the last of their triumphs. The smoke from Schweinfurt still drifted over the factories, and in the bombers' wreckage lay both tragedy and transformation. From the ashes of that defeat, the Allies would build a weapon that would reach across the continent, that would fly to Berlin and back, that would make the hunters the hunted. And though no one knew it then, the age of the Mustang had already begun. December 1943. The English countryside lay cloaked in mist, its airfields damp and echoing with the muted hum of machinery. Along the tarmac of Boxted, Leiston, and Debden, rows of olive-drab fighters waited like coiled hawks. Ground crews moved between them in silence, their breath rising in the cold morning air. The war had reached a turning point no one yet dared to name. In a drafty hangar at Leiston, Captain Don Gentile, a 22-year-old from Ohio, crouched beside his new aircraft. The words Shangri-La gleamed in white paint beneath the cockpit, a playful name for a machine built to kill. He ran his hand along the smooth fuselage, so unlike the bulky Thunderbolts he'd flown before. The wings felt alive beneath his fingers, as if the plane were holding its breath, waiting. Inside its narrow nose sat the soul of the revolution, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, built under license in the United States by Packard. It was a mechanical symphony, 12 cylinders, 1,600 horsepower, and a turbo supercharger that allowed it to sing at 30,000 feet. Combined with the Mustang's sleek airframe, it had transformed a good fighter into a phenomenon. The U.S. Army Air Forces had been skeptical at first. The old doctrine said bombers could defend themselves, that the flying fortress needed no escort beyond the coast. But Schweinfurt and Regensburg had shattered that illusion. Courage was not enough when every mission returned with half its crews gone. And so, in the final weeks of 1943, the first Merlin-powered P-51Bs crossed the Atlantic in crates, were reassembled in English hangars, and handed to men who had forgotten what hope felt like. When Gentile first opened the throttle, the Mustang surged forward with a force that made him grin despite himself. The controls were light, responsive, almost telepathic. "It flies," he later said, "like it's part of you, like you're not flying it, you're wearing it." He wasn't alone in that feeling. Major John D. Landers, another young pilot, would later describe it in simpler terms. It didn't climb, it lunged. The Mustang's range was its true miracle. With external fuel tanks slung under its wings, it could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, a distance that had once been impossible. In January 1944, when the first Mustangs joined the bomber's streams, the Luftwaffe barely noticed. To the Germans, they were just another new model, another American experiment that would vanish under cannon fire like all the rest. But that illusion didn't last long. On February 20th, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched Operation Argument, later known as Big Week. The goal was audacious: destroy the Luftwaffe's aircraft factories, cripple its fuel supplies, and break its back before the invasion of Europe. The German radar stations began to light up before dawn. Hundreds of bombers, thousands of feet high, moving in great silver phalanxes toward Leipzig, Regensburg, and Gotha. The air defense network scrambled everything it had: Bf-109s, FW-190s. Night fighters pressed into daylight service, even training squadrons. As the first formations climbed into the cold blue, their radios crackled with familiar voices. Squadron leaders urging calm, gunners loading belts of ammunition. But then came a new sound, sharp, fast, and closing in from behind the bombers, the P-51s. Captain Gentile led his flight down from 28,000 feet, sun at their backs. Below them, a formation of Messerschmitts dived toward the bombers. Gentile rolled inverted, pushed the nose down, and dove straight into the German formation. His guns spat a long burst. One 109 exploded instantly, wings separating like paper. Another broke away in flames. The Mustangs tore through the formation, climbing again before the Germans could react. To the bomber crews below, the sight was electric. For the first time, they watched enemy fighters scatter, not toward them, but away. "Mustangs! God bless those little Mustangs!" one gunner shouted over the intercom as a P-51 streaked past, its white nose flashing in the sun. From that day onward, the sky began to change. The Luftwaffe, once the master of Europe, was now being hunted in its own airspace. German ace Günther Rahl would later recall his first encounter. "They appeared out of nowhere, fast, climbing higher than anything we had. You'd turn, and they'd already be behind you. It was as if the Americans had built a machine that erased distance." In the ready rooms of the Luftwaffe, frustration began to fester. Reports came in from all sectors: Mustangs over Bremen, over Hanover, even over Berlin. The German pilots could no longer climb to safety. The P-51s were faster. They could no longer dive to escape. The P-51s followed. Even the famed Focke-Wulf 190A8, once the terror of the sky, now found itself outmatched. But perhaps the most devastating change came not from speed or firepower, but from endurance. The Germans had to defend everywhere, all the time, while the Americans could pick their battles, strike at will, and vanish again into the clouds. By spring 1944, Luftwaffe commanders like Adolf Galland knew the truth but could not say it aloud. The war for the sky was lost. Meanwhile, back in England, the tone among the American fighter groups shifted from survival to confidence. Pilots who had once counted missions until their luck ran out now itched for more. Gentile and his wingman, Captain John Godfrey, began to push the Mustang to its limits, flying low over German airfields, strafing locomotives, shooting up convoys, turning the enemy's own homeland into a hunting ground. It was during these missions that the P-51's legend began to grow. Photographs from gun cameras showed smoking trains, burning trucks, and shattered hangars. But they also showed something else: precision, elegance, and control. The Mustang was not a brute weapon, it was art. Each pilot gave his aircraft personality. Old Crow, Petey Second, the Hun Hunter. Beneath the nose, art and jokes lay something more profound: pride. For the first time, the bomber crews and the fighter pilots felt like one machine, each protecting the other. But war always answers progress with desperation. By May 1944, the Luftwaffe, bleeding pilots faster than it could replace them, began deploying teenagers fresh from flight school, some with barely 20 hours in the air. They were brave, often fanatically so, but hopelessly outmatched. The Mustangs tore through them with ruthless precision. At the same time, deep in the forests of Thuringia and Bavaria, engineers were working on a secret weapon that might yet reverse the tide: the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It promised speeds the Mustangs could never match, yet even that miracle would come too late. For now, the skies belonged to the men in the sleek green Mustangs, their silver wings glinting in the high sun. They chased their prey across all of Europe, from the North Sea to the Danube, from Normandy to Berlin. And as the bombers closed in on their targets, dropping destruction upon the very heart of German industry, one truth became clear to all who looked up at that endless sky: the hunters had become the hunted. March 4th, 1944. Berlin. For years, the German capital had been the heart of the Reich's arrogance: untouchable, unreachable. Hitler's speeches had thundered through its marble halls, and Goebbels had promised its citizens that no enemy aircraft would ever darken their skies. But that morning, the deep rumble of engines from the west shattered the illusion. Over 600 B-17 flying fortresses approached from the North Sea, their silver wings glittering in the thin sunlight. They were coming for the capital itself, an act that only months before would have been suicidal. But this time, they weren't alone. High above and ahead of them, like wolves guarding the herd, flew the new guardians, the P-51 Mustangs. Captain William Bill Overstreet tightened his harness and squinted into the morning haze. His Mustang, Berlin Express, sliced through the thin air with a song of raw power. Behind him, the bombers stretched to the horizon, each one a promise, each one a risk. Overstreet's orders were clear: protect them at all costs. As the German radar screens lit up, the alarm bells of the Reich's air defense network wailed from Hamburg to Dresden. From the bunkers near Tempelhof, Luftwaffe controllers watched in disbelief as the Americans crossed the last defensive line. Berlin was no longer a fortress. It was a target. From fields across central Germany, fighters scrambled into the gray dawn. The Bf-109s climbed hard, their thin wings trembling with effort. Among them was Oberleutnant Hans Eckehard Bob, a veteran ace who had fought since 1939. When we reached altitude, he recalled years later, I saw them, hundreds of bombers with these sleek new fighters weaving among them. It was like a storm cloud of silver. He rolled his Messerschmitt onto its side and dove toward the enemy, expecting the usual chaos. The lumbering bombers, the easy kills. But instead of helpless giants, he found Mustangs. One passed beneath him so fast he barely had time to react. Another cut across his path, climbing steeply before rolling over and diving straight at him. It was as if they were everywhere, he said. We used to own the sky. That day, it belonged to them. The P-51's arrival over Berlin marked not just a tactical shift, but a psychological one. For the first time, German civilians saw dogfights above their capital. Smoke trails laced the air over the Brandenburg countryside. Children pointed upward as falling aircraft spiraled down, some German, some American, all human. By noon, the raid was over. The bombers turned west, escorted every mile by their Mustangs. And as the sun set over England that night, the 8th Air Force realized what had just happened. Berlin had been hit, and every escorting fighter had returned home. From that moment, the Luftwaffe began to unravel. For years, it had lived on confidence, the belief in its invincibility, in its technical superiority, in the legend of its aces. Now, those legends were dying faster than the factories could replace their aircraft. By late spring, the Luftwaffe's veteran corps, men like Walter Osau, Egon Mayer, and Werner Mulder's protege, had been decimated. In their place came boys, 17-year-olds with barely enough flight hours to land safely. They were brave, but they were cannon fodder. At bases like Kassel and Jüterbog, the hangars stood half empty. Fuel shortages meant training flights were rare. Engines were saved for combat only. Mechanics stripped wrecked planes for parts under the roar of distant bombs. The once mighty Air Force of the Reich had become a ghost of itself, and the Mustangs showed no mercy. They struck not only at fighters but at the arteries of Germany's war machine. Airfields, supply trains, fuel depots. Low-level strafing missions turned the countryside into a burning landscape of wrecked locomotives and shattered trucks. Even the Luftwaffe's secret bases were not safe. One of the most daring raids came in early April. A group of Mustangs from the 4th Fighter Group followed a formation of retreating German fighters all the way to their base near Gardlegen. As the Messerschmitts came into land, the Mustangs dropped out of the clouds and opened fire. Dozens of planes were destroyed on the ground before the Americans climbed away untouched. For the German pilots, the psychological toll was unbearable. "We could not even take off without being hunted," wrote Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Demes in his diary. "They waited for us in the sky. The moment we climbed, they were already above us." Even the legendary Adolf Galland, once the Luftwaffe S Golden Ace, admitted the hopelessness of their situation. "The air war over Germany," he later said, "was lost the moment the Mustangs arrived." Across the Channel, victory did not feel triumphant. It felt relentless. The American pilots were now flying 3, sometimes 4, missions a week. Fatigue etched itself into their faces. Many were just 20 years old, yet their eyes looked decades older. Between missions, they drank coffee that tasted of oil and smoked cigarettes in silence, staring at the empty bunks of those who hadn't come back. For all its elegance, the Mustang was still a war machine, and war machines demand blood. Captain Don Gentile, whose Shangri-La had become one of the most celebrated fighters in Europe, was forced to stop flying combat after he destroyed his aircraft during a low-level victory roll, an act of joy that ended in disaster. He survived, but his war was over. Others weren't so lucky. Major James Goodson, another famed pilot, was shot down over Germany and captured. The enemy was collapsing, but the cost was steep. By June 1944, when Allied troops landed in Normandy, the Luftwaffe barely stirred. Its remaining fighters, grounded by lack of fuel or destroyed in their hangars, could only watch as the invasion unfolded. The skies over France belonged entirely to the Allies. In the chaos of D-Day, the Mustangs ranged freely, strafing convoys, blasting trains, cutting communications, their dominance absolute. The German soldiers on the beaches looked up and saw their once invincible air force reduced to smoke and silence. Still, the Mustangs pressed on. Their mission was no longer survival, but annihilation. Every airfield, every train, every movement of the enemy was fair game. The war in the air had become a hunt, and the hunters no longer wore the Iron Cross. For those who fought in the Luftwaffe, the transformation was almost surreal. The proud defenders of Europe, who once looked down upon the burning cities of others, now looked up and saw their own world in flames. From the shattered remains of Schweinfurt to the ruins of Berlin, one message had become unmistakable. The Reich had lost control of the sky, and with it, the war. September 1944. The sky above Germany was no longer blue. It was gray with smoke, streaked with contrails that crossed and twisted like scars. The once proud Luftwaffe was bleeding out, its fighter fields cratered, its supply lines shattered, its pilots exhausted. Yet, in the quiet corners of hidden hangars, something extraordinary was stirring. The final gamble of a desperate regime. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It was sleek, alien, and terrifyingly fast. With twin Junkers UMO engines slung under its wings, it could reach speeds of nearly 550 miles per hour, almost 200 faster than the Mustang. To the German engineers who had worked in secret tunnels and forested airstrips, it was a promise, a weapon that could turn back the tide, that could make the sky theirs again. But the promise came too late. Fuel was scarce, pilots were scarce, and time, the one resource no nation could manufacture, had already run out. When the first Me-262s entered combat in the summer of 1944, they caused brief panic among Allied bomber crews. The jets appeared suddenly out of nowhere, streaking past the formations with blinding speed, unleashing bursts of 30mm cannon fire before vanishing into the clouds. No piston-engine aircraft could catch them. The Mustang pilots called them silver streaks of death. Yet even this wonder weapon could not change the outcome. For every Me-262 that reached the sky, 2 more were destroyed on the ground by roving Mustangs. The jets required long, vulnerable takeoff runs, and Allied fighters learned to wait near their bases. As soon as a 262 lifted off, P-51s pounced like hawks. One after another, Germany's miracle machines were burned before they could fight. Captain Chuck Yeager, a young Mustang pilot who would later break the sound barrier, remembered one such encounter vividly. "We caught them on the runway. Beautiful planes, futuristic, but they were helpless. We strafed until there was nothing left but fire and twisted metal." Across Germany, the pattern repeated. Invention met annihilation. While engineers struggled to assemble a few jets, the Mustang squadrons swarmed overhead in hundreds. Their numbers seemed endless. Each dawn, the sky filled with the low growl of Merlin engines as wave after wave of P-51s crossed the channel. Hunting trains, convoys, anything that moved. For the German civilians below, the sight of those dark silhouettes had become a symbol of inevitability. Children in bomb shelters whispered of the long-nosed devils that came with the sun. Farmers stopped working when they heard the distant hum. It meant another strafing run was coming. The war had grown intimate. No longer fought at the front, but above every field and village. By late autumn, the Luftwaffe's command network had fractured entirely. Experienced aces were dead, replacements barely trained. Many new pilots had less than 20 hours in the air before being sent into combat. They took off trembling, clutching their control sticks like lifelines, often dying within their first sortie. At Paderborn, one Luftwaffe instructor wrote in his logbook, "We send them up as boys. They come down as smoke." Meanwhile, the Americans had turned their aerial campaign into an unstoppable rhythm. The Mustangs were no longer merely escorts. They were predators. Their pilots now had a freedom of action the Luftwaffe had once claimed. They roamed deep into enemy territory, attacking supply trains, barges, and columns of retreating troops. The most famous of these hunters was Major George Preddy of the 352nd Fighter Group, known as the Blue-Nosed Bastards of Bodney. Preddy was tall, quiet, and deadly efficient. On Christmas Day 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, he downed 6 German aircraft in a single mission. a record that would stand as one of the war's most extraordinary feats. But even heroes were mortal. Less than a week later, Preddy was killed by friendly fire while chasing a focke-wulf at treetop level near Liège. His death symbolized what the air war had become: total, unrelenting, and merciless to all. As 1945 dawned, the German skies were filled with thunder. The Allies struck at will, bombing bridges, rail yards, and cities that no longer had the strength to fight back. The Mustangs escorted every formation, their silver wings gleaming in the winter light. Over Berlin, over Munich, over the frozen fields of Saxony, they ruled like silent sentinels. For the Luftwaffe, there were no longer missions, only survival. Pilots flew without orders, sometimes without fuel, just to escape the Allied advance. The few Me-262s still operational fled west, hoping to surrender to the Americans rather than fall into Soviet hands. In one of the final air battles of the war near Augsburg, a formation of Mustangs intercepted a flight of Me-262s attempting to flee. Despite their speed, 2 jets were destroyed before they could reach altitude. The rest vanished into the haze, ghosts of a dream that had come too late. Back in England, the mood among the American pilots was subdued. Victory was near, but it no longer felt like triumph. The laughter and swagger of early days had faded. Each squadron had its empty chairs, its names carved into wooden tables, friends who had gone up and never returned. Captain John Godfrey, once Gentile's wingman, described it in a letter home. "We've won the sky, but I don't think anyone feels like winners anymore. The Germans don't come up much now. It's just us, the bombers, and the smoke." When spring finally came, it came quietly. The great airfields of Germany lay in ruins, craters, twisted propellers, burnt-out hulks of what had once been a fleet of thousands. The Luftwaffe flag was lowered, its proud eagle broken. And yet, amidst that devastation, there was a strange peace in the air, the silence of skies that no longer roared with death. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, the surviving Mustang pilots gathered on their runways. They removed their helmets and stared toward the continent they had fought over for nearly 3 relentless years. Some smiled, others simply sat in silence. The war in the air was over. For the Luftwaffe, it had ended not in glory, but in exhaustion, a long descent into ruin. For the Americans, it had been a journey from chaos to mastery, from slaughter to supremacy, and at the center of it all, gleaming in the sunlight, stood the machine that had made it possible, the North American P-51 Mustang. It was more than an aircraft. It was the embodiment of an idea, that courage, technology, and persistence could reclaim the impossible. The hunters had fallen, the hunted had risen, and the sky, once ruled by fear, now belonged to freedom. March 1945. The Pacific War had become a storm of fire and desperation. Across Iwo Jima's black sands, the Marines pushed forward under a constant barrage of mortars and machine gun fire. The air stank of sulfur, blood, and the charred remnants of war. Above the din, a calm voice spoke into the headset of a field radio. Dibe, Nash Du Lin. To anyone else, it was gibberish. To the Marine artillery batteries offshore, it was precision. Seconds later, American shells fell with mathematical accuracy upon hidden Japanese bunkers that had pinned down the advance. That voice belonged to Corporal Samuel Sandoval, one of the original 29 Navajo code talkers whose creation had become the unbreakable nerve system of the Marine Corps. Through them, chaos was translated into order. Instant, secure communication that turned confusion into lethal coordination. The Japanese heard every word, recorded every message, and sent their best cryptographers to dissect them. They compared hundreds of transmissions, searching for patterns or repetitions, looking for even a single crack. None came. The Navajo language, combined with the code's internal logic, was a wall no one could scale. The enemy's smartest linguists, men who could recite the structure of Latin, Russian, and Chinese, could not even identify the language being spoken. To them, it was as alien as the sound of wind moving through desert canyons. Inside the Marine command tent, a communications officer named Major Howard Connor kept 6 Navajo radio men operating continuously during the height of Iwo Jima's fighting. In 48 hours, they transmitted over 800 coded messages, none of them containing a single error. Every coordinate, every status report, every order arrived unbroken. Connor later told war correspondents, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." As the weeks went on, the code talkers became both witnesses and instruments of history. They saw comrades fall, islands burn, and the Pacific shrink one beachhead at a time. And yet, even as victory approached, they carried a quiet burden, one of anonymity. Their code, their language, their triumph was a secret so vital that it would remain classified for decades. Back in Japan, Commander Atsuzo Kurihara of Naval Intelligence faced the ruin of his unit's once proud confidence. His final report, typed in frustration, admitted, "Despite exhaustive analysis, the American Field Communications Code remains undecipherable. We have no linguistic basis for its structure." The Japanese cryptologic section was dissolved shortly after. In Tokyo, the realization set in that an ancient tribal tongue, spoken by fewer than 30,000 people in the American Southwest, had helped shape the war's end. When peace finally came in August 1945, the world shifted. The Pacific turned from battleground to memory. The young Navajo men returned to their reservations quietly, without parades or recognition. Their work was still secret. Many went back to sheep herding, farming, or the stillness of desert life. They carried within them the knowledge that they had spoken the words that directed fleets, guided invasions, and saved thousands of lives, yet could tell no one. It was not until 1968 that the Code Talker program was officially declassified. Only then did the full scope of their contribution come into the light. The surviving men, their hair now silvered, were invited to Marine reunions where former generals embraced them with tears in their eyes. The United States Congress eventually awarded them medals of honor, though many had already passed into history. At Fort Defiance and Window Rock, memorials now stand etched with their names. Visitors still come, Marines, historians, descendants, to read the list of men whose voices carried through the noise of the Pacific. Those who stand before the monument can almost hear them again, speaking their sacred language not as warriors, but as messengers of survival. And what of the code itself? It was never broken, not once, not during the war, not after. Modern supercomputers have since analyzed its structure, and linguists have studied its genius, a hybrid of natural language and military brevity, built on cultural metaphor. Turtle meant tank. Hummingbird meant fighter plane. Ironfish meant submarine. It was poetic and tactical all at once, a weapon forged not of steel but of identity. For the Navajo Nation, the story of the Code Talkers became more than military legend. It was a restoration of dignity. Their ancestors had endured forced marches, suppression of language, and the erasure of culture. Yet, when the world teetered on destruction, that very culture became a shield for millions. The language once forbidden in American schools had become a fortress for freedom. In museums across the United States, radios from the Pacific Campaign sit behind glass, their metal faces dull with age. But for those who know the story, they are not silent artifacts. They are the echo chambers of the Navajo tongue, the unseen heartbeat of the Marine advance. When modern Marines train, they still learn of the Code Talkers, not only for their service, but for their reminder that strength can emerge from the unlikeliest corners of humanity. And somewhere in the quiet desert of New Mexico, the wind still carries the syllables of an old language, unchanged, resilient, eternal. The same wind that once carried messages across oceans now drifts over mesas and canyons, whispering stories that machines could never decode. In the end, the war of radios and riddles was not won by encryption machines, but by men whose ancestors spoke to the earth, whose words flowed like water through stone. It was won by memory, by identity, by the voice of a people who never forgot who they were, even when the world almost forgot them. As dawn breaks over Monument Valley, the red rocks catch the sun in the same way they did in 1942, when a young Navajo recruit first spoke into a radio and changed history. His message, though long since faded into static, still lingers in the air, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful code is the one written in the heart of a people.